Good evening, everybody. David Burns with you today. Hello to Beak Squad. Wearing the Beak Squad shirt today. Welcome aboard to our live stream tonight. Got a great program set for the next hour. So appreciate you being here with us tonight. Hope you had a great day out in your daily activities or maybe out in your bee yard today. And everything's going good here at our honeybee farm. We had a good day outside doing some videos for you guys and working some hives. The bees are really in the fall mode. But I want to let you guys know that we have a very special program set for tonight. We have a very special guest I'm going to bring on right now. And we want to welcome to the stream Dr. David Peck. Hi, David.
Hi there, Other David. It's a pleasure to meet you. I guess I'm Other David. You're the host, so I'm Other David.
Well, two Davids together, it's got to be a great night, that's for sure. Good to have you along with us. I want to introduce David. He's currently the Director of Research and Education at Better Bee in New York. And he received his doctorate from Cornell and in Ithaca, New York. And he has where he studied with Dr. Tom Seeley that probably everybody knows. So, David, you have some strong credentials with you for sure.
Wow. I certainly do, and I do my best to live up to them and fail every day, but you can only strive.
Yeah. I have a good friend that's a PhD as well, an entomologist, and he has, I think, about 50 acronyms that he assigns to that PhD. It's quite hilarious. It's good to have you with us today, and I'm going to start off with something really tough and really maybe fun. And maybe I'll answer it too, but I'll ask you first. What is it that you love the most about beekeeping, and what is it that you hate the most about beekeeping?
I hate the heat. I was born in Baltimore. I moved up to Boston for school, and then I've lived in New York ever since. I've settled up here. And even so, I couldn't have chosen a worse hobby because you go right out in the middle of the sunniest field, you plonk your bees down, you put on extra clothes, and then you stand out there and lift heavy boxes.
Yeah.
So easily the heat is the thing I like the least. I'm your man to do an early spring or a late fall, mite treatment or something like that, because I'm happy cold but not happy hot.
Oh, yeah.
My favorite part of beekeeping, gosh, it's hard. I mean, it's the bees themselves. It's not the honey. It's not the profitability of it. It's not the the attention I get. It's getting to sit there and look closely at bees. I'm an animal behaviorist by training, and so since I was a little kid, I've always just loved looking at creatures doing what they do. Yeah. And as a beekeeper, I can put on that veil. I can put on gloves or no gloves. I can get right up into a hive, next to a hive, and watch bees doing a thing that other folks wouldn't feel safe or comfortable doing. So I always feel privileged when I get to do that.
Oh, yeah.
How about yourself?
Yeah, I would say what I love the most is very similar to what you said. I love working the bees. I just love watching them and experiencing them, just experimenting with the bees. I love every aspect of that. Almost every time I open a hive up, there's something to observe that is fascinating to me. That never gets boring.
Yep.
But what I hate most is really going to probably surprise a lot of people. I hate harvesting honey the most. I hate it the most. I really do, because not because I love the harvest. I love the time. I love the experience, but it's hard work and it's so messy. One drop of honey in the wrong spot will get everywhere.
Right.
I don't know how one drop can get on everything. It is just a lot of mess to me, and I don't like that part.
The more successful you are, the harder the work is, because the more hives you have, the more honey they make, the more boxes you've got to clear of bees and then pull and then uncap and then run through the whole system and then get back onto hives.
Yep.
I was set up early to hate honey harvesting too, because in Tom Seeley's lab, as a matter of convenience, he didn't want to have different sizes of frame. And so he decided long ago that he was only going to use deeps. So we only used deep 10-frame supers, and sometimes I'd have a colony 4 or 5 or 6 boxes tall, and I was just pulling deep supers off when it was time to harvest honey. So I did not enjoy that process, least of all because I was doing it in the heat.
Oh, man, I hope your back is going to withstand when you get older now.
It's already shot. I'm already an advocate for, look, if your back hurts when you're out in your bees, you should be shifting to an all medium setup or even an all shallow setup. There's no rules that says you can't put bees and have them make brood in shallow boxes. It's just more frames to go through during an inspection.
Yeah. I think my bees really love me more than most beekeepers because, they make all these honey supers. I've got 4, 5, 6 honey supers on, and they're like, oh, we're going to lose 4 of them. And they don't. They get all because I harvest it, he's not going to take these. Why do we work so hard?
Perfect.
Oh yeah. So they love me for that.
Oh, good.
Well, I know one of your specialties is dealing with parasites, especially the mites. And you've given a lot of great talks here on YouTube, on other live streams, and of course, Hive Live. You've got some great talks on mites. I want to ask some questions tonight, David, because we have a lot of beekeepers on the live stream tonight they're new. They're like 1 to 3 year beekeepers, and they have some, I think, very legitimate questions for a new beginner. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times they ask me this: you know what? Why do I have to test? Wouldn't it be easier just if I treat it for mites, assuming that they're there? And if they're not there, the testing or the treating really can't hurt anything. What do you think about that?
So the gold standard is you test to see if you have a mite problem. If you do, you do a treatment, and then you test again to make sure that your treatment actually had a good effect, that you don't have a further problem or it only half solved it, so you don't have to do something else. If you don't have time to do both of those, you can get rid of that follow-up test, and you can say, if I have a problem, I'm going to treat. I'm going to hope that the treatments did what they were supposed to. If you don't have time to do that either, then if the option is either monitor and then ignore whatever the data tells you, or just go ahead and treat, I would say go ahead and treat. If you're only going to do one thing to manage mites, I'd rather that you treat. But the advantage of doing that monitoring to figure out if it's necessary is, number one, you save yourself money and headache and stress and work having to go and set up each of those treatments. And you're going to save your bees chemical stress. We've got sort of nicer miticides and harsher miticides, but every single miticide is imposing some weird new chemical stress on our bees. And we know that they're stressed by, climate change, by habitat loss. They're stressed by nutritional issues. They're stressed by pesticides. They're stressed by, parasites and diseases. So why would we add an extra chemical? Why would we fill the colony up with formic acid or thymol or oxalic or hops beta acids or amitraz if we can avoid it, because we know that there's no reason to put it in? We know that the mites are below that treatment threshold. Yep. So I think it saves you and your bees time and stress, and it also saves you, the beekeeper, money, which I'm always happy to help somebody do.
Oh yeah. I like your answer. It's it gives a little bit of wiggle room because in reality, life happens sometimes. Life gets in the way of beekeeping, and some people just can't make all those 3 things.
Right. You're busy at work for 3 weeks, and then you've got to go on a vacation. You've only got 1 day to do your beekeeping. Don't go out and do your samples and then your treatment. Just go ahead and do the treatment. That it's not like there couldn't be a downside. You use formic acid. Sometimes you're going to have a queen that dies. Yeah. You use thymol, and then if the weather gets hot, it's possible you're going to kill off more bees than you wanted to. But by doing that treatment, you're going to eliminate the mites, and we know that not managing mites will kill your bees. Yeah. So it's better to go ahead and do that. But certainly I'd recommend the monitor and then treat whenever you have the time and the bandwidth to do it.
Yeah. I love it. I tell my community here to always test, treat, and test. Yeah. And that's the optimal thing if you can pull that off, because that gives you a lot of information for sure. Right. While we're talking on the subject, everybody always asks me, David, what treatment do you use? What treatment should I use? What treatment do I need to use right now? And I keep saying that I really can't speak to that for you. And my philosophy is it's a myriad of information, but it's like, I'm not sure what state you're in. I'm not sure what your conditions are, your temperatures. I'm not sure if you have honey supers on or honey supers off. I'm not sure what your finances are. I just can't give a pat answer to that. And that's a struggle for new beginners, because a lot of new beginners just want somebody else to say, look, I got a sore throat. I need 500 milligrams of amoxicillin. What do I do with my bees? We have, I think, a new entry of beekeepers that are used to getting pretty fast answers. Yeah. And I like, if you're going to go down the road of really pursuing treatments, that you need to also do the research, that you need to figure out everything you can about that particular treatment and if
Right.
it's right for you. What's your take
But
on that?
so you said that people ask you sort of what should I treat with, and that's a question that I find myself answering a lot. You know, folks call the Better Bee hotline, and the front desk can't answer. They'll send you to me, and
Yeah.
I'll ask every single question you just mentioned. Where are you? What temperature? Are the supers on? How strong is the colony? How many frames of bees? Is there an active brood nest? How big is it? All of that. But the real answer, the question I often get is people just come in and they'll say, look, I'm into bees. I'm excited about bees, but bees are really complicated. They're more complicated than I thought. My brain is swimming in all this new bee knowledge. And I learned that there's this parasitic mite, and I've learned that you got to buy a medicine to treat it. But I don't want to keep learning about this stuff. This is the gross, sad, yucky side of beekeeping. I want to learn about the fun, cooperation, and honey production side of beekeeping. So they sort of just want to get Varroa compartmentalized so quickly and so completely that they can just say, I like using Apivar strips. I like using, formic acid pads. I like using Formic Pro. And so I'm not going to learn anything else. So people come to me with that mindset and they say, what's the best miticide? What's the one miticide that I should just always be using? And my answer is just what you were saying, is there is no right miticide for every situation, for every colony. But the right thing to do is to treat with the correct miticide for your bees at your time under your conditions. And it's a different one. I might say to somebody, I'm typically going to use formic acid in July unless it's too hot. I'm typically going to do an oxalic acid vaporization or a dribble, between November, between like Thanksgiving and Christmas. If I get a decent day to go out to the hives, I'll go and do those. So those are sort of rules of thumb that I might encourage people to kind of build into their mindset. But I think you're exactly right. It's crazy to say to somebody, you should use Formic Pro in your hives because I'm using Formic Pro in my hives this 4th of July weekend. Because for a lot of folks, it's going to be way too hot to use Formic, and they're going to wind up killing their entire colony with it. It's a great miticide under the right conditions. It's a horrible miticide under the wrong ones. And that's really true of all of them. They're either ineffective or they're great at killing mites, but they're just as good at killing bees at the wrong temperature. Or, they'll kill all the mites, but they'll also contaminate your honey so you can't safely eat it or sell it.
Yeah.
So you've just got to learn each one.
Yep. And sometimes beekeepers don't look at treatments the way that they need to be looked at. A lot of times we don't view them as really something that could damage us or the honey or the bees. And, we just think it doesn't really matter. I learned recently when I was at EAS, I was talking to Tom Nolan with Formic Pro, and he actually told me that expired Formic Pro actually becomes more powerful, volatile. It becomes more stronger.
Yeah, I was also surprised to learn that, and it's because what the formic acid pad is sort of a sugar gel matrix that they've engineered so that it time releases that formic acid at the right rate. When that package expires, when the formic acid product expires, the formic acid is still there and it's still formic acid. What's expired is that time release technology. That's broken down too far.
Yeah.
So you've got folks using this old stuff and saying, well, I thought, it might kill some of my mites, even though it wasn't that good. So it's hot, but it was expired. And they're intuiting it completely wrong, because what's really expired is the thing that holds that formic in for at least a couple of days after the package is opened.
Yeah, and then they wonder, and then they think, wow, Formic Pro killed my queen. Formic Pro had more brood death.
Right. It was only 3 days expired, or 3 years expired, but that can't possibly have been part of the problem.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's important that each beekeeper really does take a look at that label. That's what I'm really trying to encourage my viewers to always do, is take ownership of your treatments, and don't ask the Facebook group or your folks here and there, how should I use this? When should I, why don't you do your math and your evaluation of your environment and your bees and determine which of these treatments based on the label, which is the law. Follow that label. That's really what we need to be doing. It's a tough thing to do. I mean, even with, oxalic acid, we have a lot of people just not following that label at all anymore.
And you're exactly right. It's homework, and it is not the fun part of beekeeping to sit there and study through an EPA approved label and try to calculate, well, I've got 8 frame hives, but this is clearly written for 10 frames, but it's based on the number of frames of brood. So do I use 3 strips or 4 strips? And you sit there with your calculator and you figure it out. And it's not fun, but once you do it once, you can just write down in your notebook, hey, when I'm treating my hives, I only need to use X number of strips based on the label. and then you're not going to have to do it again. But yeah, it's just like memorizing how to recognize the difference between, queen brood and drone brood and worker brood. It's just memorization, and you've just got to do it, because once you do it, it's very easy to apply and it'll become second nature. But you got to do the homework.
All of these treatment companies do a great job, both in their literature and on their websites. I mean, a lot of people ask me questions about the product, and I just refer them to the website, because all the questions they're asking, with supers, without supers, what's the temperature, and how do I put them in? It's all answered on their website. Frequently asked questions almost on every product. It's amazing.
You mentioned NOD, and they're particularly good. People ask me questions about formic acid, and sometimes the answer is just I Googled it and found the FAQ page, and then I just gave them that answer.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Hey, I got $1 million question for you.
Wow, go for it.
This is going to be a good one. What exactly are those bees doing on the front of the hive when they're doing that washboarding thing? What's going on?
Yeah, that's something we actually talked about in the Sealy lab one summer. We had a student who was interested in studying it, and we all sat around and we helped her brainstorm, and she didn't figure it out, and other folks have tried and they haven't figured it out. There are some good hypotheses out there, and none of them have anything that refutes them, but none of them have a great deal of support in favor of them. Is it that washboarding behavior, that moving of the mandibles over the surface, is removing the sort of bee odor cues or pheromone cues that might attract the attention of a predator, a bear or some dragonfly or a wasp that's flying around sniffing out for honeybees? Could be that. Is it that they're ripping off all of those fibers so that the bees aren't getting their tarsal claws caught as they're coming in and out of the entrance? Because it does tend to be right in that landing zone. Maybe is it to prevent fungal infection? Remember, these bees aren't naturally living in boxes in our yards. They're naturally living in a tree with a great big hollow cavity in it. That's not the healthiest situation for a tree to be in. So you could certainly imagine that maybe that has some medicative effect for the tree. They're pulling off all the little fungal spores that might otherwise infect it right near the entrance and then cause it to rot. So all of those are reasonable hypotheses, but I don't know. And I know a lot of other people have tried and they don't know either.
Okay, good. I'll keep saying I don't know, because that's all I know. People ask me that all the time. Now, new beginners they'll email me or something, and I'll say, David, my bees are doing this weird thing. They're like vibrating on the front of my hive. It's like washboarding. And there has been a lot of people that have actually studied it. I think we know they're younger bees. They're
right. We know who's doing it. We just don't quite know why.
And I've watched them, really up close to determine what exactly are they licking? Are they scrubbing? Are they trying to get something off? And I can't see anything that they're doing.
And it seems to be variable. I have seen bees using their mandibles during washboarding, and I've seen bees not doing anything with their mouth parts. And I did some field research in southern Madagascar, and they've got a native subspecies of honeybee, Apis mellifera unicolor, there that I was working with. And they seemed to be much more interested in washboarding than most bees I was used to. Now, is that because those bees are more washboardy, or is it because they were in these sort of rough hives? They didn't have milled lumber available, so each beekeeper was sort of splitting logs or sawing logs, getting stuff, cobbling together their brood boxes. So maybe something about that texture was triggering more of it. I don't know, but I did notice that they seemed to be doing an awful lot more washboarding in that circumstance.
I guess if we had a way to study it, we could find a hive that's doing really good washboarding, a lot of bees out there, and then if we had a fast way to change the surface, then we could say, they washboard on this surface, but look, they're not washboarding at all on a plate of glass or a mirror or something like that.
Right, yeah, or, here I put a sheet of sandpaper and then I take that off and I replace it with a paper towel, or I replace it with something coated in Teflon so that there's nothing sticking to it. I think that there's certainly options. Yeah, if somebody wants to do it, I'd happily review the paper when you submit it for publication.
All right, that's good. Now, David, a few things I have changed over the years in my understanding of bees, beekeeping, and practices. And it's just because, you're a scientist, and as science is, when better science presents itself, then you have to change. You have to say, well,
Right.
this data says this, so I'm not going to be doing that anymore.
It's a process of well-informed change. You're never static in science.
Yeah, that's right. And that's true. And if you get static, I feel like, you get too close-minded. You're just not open for something. So for
Mhm.
me, I've made changes. Like, it was forever before I ever thought about going to a screen bottom board.
Mhm.
And I do like screens, but I have a mixture of both. I use them at different times in different ways and so forth. But one of the things I really changed that I really believed in that I don't anymore, I don't practice it anymore. And it's more not really science so much as what I see my bees doing, and that is using pollen patties. I
Mm.
really loved pollen patties in the beginning because I saw my bees eating them, or I saw them going away.
Right.
And then over time, though, when small hive beetle began to make such a presentation in my bee yards, that was tough because now I'm looking at, small hive beetle larvae in my pollen patties.
Mhm.
And it was really attracting small hive beetle.
Yes.
And so I just started getting away from pollen patties for that purpose, really all alone. And I had
Mhm.
another person that said he did a little experiment. He mixed like a black light powder, glow in the dark powder, and made a pollen patty with it. And then after it was gone, he scanned the area, and he said the bees were mostly getting rid of it, taking it outside the hive.
I think there is a lot of that, that it looks like they're taking in these things that we put on top, and it's actually just they're cleaning up, and we feel like we've done something, but really they're doing all the work. Plus, we've added a cleaning chore to them.
Yeah.
No, you're exactly right about the pollen patties and the hive beetles. And we as beekeepers sometimes think of small hive beetles as a honey pest, because when you take a honey super, you remove all of the bees that are guarding it, then the small hive beetles can cause problems when those supers are sitting around in your garage waiting to be extracted. But a small hive beetle, just like any creature, as a baby, wants to get a high protein diet, not a high sugar diet. So they would much rather be eating brood, be eating pollen, be eating wax that has high protein in it, or be eating pollen patties. So they're really particularly keyed into high protein sources like a pollen patty.
Oh,
And the
yeah.
folks I know who do use them are typically in small hive beetle country are putting it down to maybe the size of a silver dollar, and they're putting in a
Yeah.
little dollop periodically.
Yep.
But you're right. I think a lot of beekeepers get into their heads, I'm supposed to be helping my bees, and so in the spring I feed them pollen, and in the fall I feed them syrup, and in the winter I feed them fondant. And all of those things have their very important uses, but they're not necessary for every colony. If your colony has plenty of honey, you don't need to feed them syrup. If they have plenty of honey, you don't need to give them fondant either, because they have that honey and they'll eat it. In the spring, if you feed your bees pollen patties, and we have this problem even up north here where we don't have a very big problem with hive beetles. When folks will buy the pollen patties, they'll install them into a colony during their first inspection, and the colony will just go gangbusters. They absolutely start reproducing like crazy, having a huge amount of brood, and then they call us a month later and say, my colony just swarmed. And we say, yeah, well, you gave them far more protein than they needed. They grew too fast. The pollen producing plants couldn't keep up with it. And so they had no choice but to say, well, we'll take a brood break and split, and now there's going to be two of us. So if you're trying to breed bees out of a few survivors so that you can split them and get back up to your numbers before you to recover from your overwinter losses, yeah, there might be a time and a place to do some pollen patty feeding. But I don't think that it's in any way necessary. And I think for a lot of beekeepers, it's not appropriate. It makes the colonies grow too big too quickly, and they become much harder to manage than most, especially new beekeepers, want to deal with.
Yeah. Well, I got a video clip, David, I want to show you. Let me
Oh
bring
yeah.
it up. Yeah, and it's be interesting. We won't be able to talk, so just hold your comments until it's done playing. But I'll put this in between. Okay. So this is something that, quite honestly, a lot of beekeepers have trouble with. I get probably 10 or 15 of our customers a year that will say something about, hey, there's bees under my hive. And in this case, in this video, they're actually building comb under there. So I'm left to conclude two things: that either a stray queen showed up there and some bees got alongside of her and tried to make a home there with her and it kind of grew, or a swarm landed there, and just started setting up house.
In that video, was the hive above occupied as well? Were they
Yes,
laying in that brood nest? Okay,
absolutely.
interesting.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think you're probably right. It probably was a swarm, and I say that in part based on my own experience. So a big part of my doctoral work was trying to catch bees in Cornell's Arnott Forest, the survivor population of bees that have not been treated for mites that are able to survive despite mite infestation. So one of my jobs was catching those swarms, bringing them back, putting them into regular Langstroth equipment, and then looking for different mite resistance characteristics, mite resistance traits, to see if they had them or didn't. And so the way I did that, because there's a lot of bears in the forest, is that I hung just 5-frame nuke boxes that I had modified and turned into bait hives. Didn't put any chemical lures in there other than some old sort of smelly brood comb. Put them in there, drilled a hole in the side, and I put these things up, hanging with a couple of guy wires from the trees. And on 2 occasions, I wish I knew offhand, I'd have to find my thesis, but I think I caught probably 15, 18 swarms over the course of the research, and then a lot of it was just splitting and mating further colonies. But of all of those swarms that I caught, 2 of them, I showed up and I saw this big structure hanging underneath the box, and it was a bunch of bees, and they looked like they were swarming, but when I looked closely, they actually had lobes of comb they built underneath. And in both cases, I went inside, and there were only maybe 10 or 15 bees in the box. So what that means is that a swarm of bees left a bee tree out in the middle of this forest. The scouts went and they found this box. They went inside. They said, "This smells like comb. This is clearly a bee colony. We should all fly there." And the swarm showed up, and for whatever reason, they just didn't want to go inside. They just built underneath instead. And so these were open, exposed colonies, just swinging in the breeze, building probably 5 or 6 lobes of comb by the time I found at least the bigger one that I'm picturing in my head. Yeah. And they didn't want to go into the box. They just wanted to live down there. So I think sometimes swarms will just get things a little bit screwy when they're trying to choose where they're going to live.
Oh yeah, let me tell you about a mistake I made years and years ago. Similar thing happened. I noticed that there was a swarm that landed on the top side, back side of a hive, right? And so it's just gigantic swarm on the back side. Now inside, everything is going good. Bees are foraging in and out. So I thought to myself, maybe I'll just crack this lid and let the swarm walk into this hive,
merge. Yeah.
So I did that, and it sounded, if you could animate it, it'd be like boom, like a Batman scene. Pow! Boom, the box was rattling and shaking, and dead bees. You can see the bees battling on the front porch or the bottom board. It was just like, oh no.
Yeah.
They did not get along well at all. And they finally merged together, but it was there was a lot of casualties.
It was hairy. Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I often say to people is, I had somebody call today and they said, well, my husband and I were extracting honey, and there was some brood in it, but we weren't sure if that would be okay or not. So we uncapped it and then we extracted it, and now the honey's really cloudy. What should I do? And I said, what you're going to do is you're going to sit down and you're going to reflect upon this, and you're going to say, I did so many things right. I kept my bees alive until September. I managed to pull these boxes and get all the bees out of them. I know how to uncap a frame. I know how to run it through the extractor. The only thing I did wrong is I extracted a whole bunch of half brood, and they've now contaminated my honey, and I got to throw it away. But you learn from those mistakes as long as you're paying attention. So I'm sure you learned when you find a swarm on top of an established colony that the introduction better be managed a little better than just opening the door wide.
Yeah, right. When you're done reading the newspaper, put it to work.
Right.
So I'm curious though, that little bit of brood in that honey, you say you think it contaminated the honey?
Yeah, both by adding higher protein and insect parts, which are obviously not what anyone wants to get in a jar of honey. But more importantly, from the way she described it, enough brood got in that I think that the sugar concentration would have been too low. They've added too much moisture, and it's going to cause it to ferment. And it's going to ferment and start to spoil as the protein from those larvae go through it.
Yeah.
So she was an experienced mead maker, and I said, look, my first and foremost advice is throw it away. But if you are experienced making mead and you have to add protein to honey to make mead ferment properly anyway, you could try it, but certainly don't sell it. Don't serve it at a dinner party until you've tried it and made sure it didn't kill you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, David, I know you work with a lot of new beginners, answering their
Mhm.
questions when they call in to Better Bee and get to you. And I wonder if you're seeing something that I'm seeing, and I wanted to share this and maybe to be an encouragement, hopefully, to our new beginners that are watching. But like I said earlier, we live in a time when I believe people are able to find really quick answers to their problems or their questions.
Mhm.
And a lot of people would rather do that. And I find in beekeeping, I started beekeeping in the early 90s and things were a lot different back then. But it seems like now that beekeeping for a lot of people is that they're wanting it to be formulaic. They're wanting it to be a recipe. They're
Yes.
saying, what day do I do this? What day of the month do I do it? What month of the year do I do this? What's the timing? What's the sequence? And I find that you really can't do beekeeping by the numbers. Now, there are some
Mhm.
things that bees follow that are numbers, but for the most part, I love science. I'm a certified master beekeeper. I love science. I promote science, but there's a point where you take your science and it goes and carries you into an art or a skill that you
Yeah.
develop after a season of beekeeping. And so you and I both helping new beginners, I'm trying not to just give an answer. I'm
Yes.
trying to say, what would you do? Let's think through this. What's a possibility, do you think, that some things that might work? Why
Yeah.
would this be showing itself? It just seems like we need to get more, is it Socratic
Yeah,
education where
that
we
that would be the Socratic method, is that you
Socratic, yeah.
train their mind to come up with the answer and
Yeah.
justify that answer they came up with on their own. And you just nod sagely and say, "Yep, you figured it out."
Yeah, yeah. I think it's hard to do because I think, people are, like you said earlier, they're desperate. This has been fun. I've been
Yeah.
enjoying it. Now I have a
Now I
problem.
have a problem.
Give me
Yeah.
an answer.
Solve it for me.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
need my hive needs CPR. I don't need to
Yeah.
learn. I need CPR. What do I do?
Yeah, I think the recipe metaphor is exactly right. And I even have people call me and say, "I just want the recipe, tell me what to do."
Yeah.
And I have seen a lot of lectures. So as you said, I give bee lectures all over the place, and I'm always happy to give more because I think it's a really helpful way to have these conversations and teach people. But one thing that I do in my lectures that I don't see in that many other bee lectures is that a lot of folks come out and they say, "We've got to kill Varroa mites. Let's start memorizing how the miticides work." Or we've got to, manage swarming. So here's my recipe for managing swarming. Boom, 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 boom. If you take a swarming and splitting class with me, if you go listen to my small hive beetle lecture or my Varroa lecture, we're going to spend a lot of time at the beginning talking about the biology. I talk about the biology of swarming. Why are they doing it? When are they doing it? What's going on during a swarm? Because if we take 40 minutes to talk about exactly what the swarming process is, when we then get to the applied stuff, the recipe section, where I start telling you what you're supposed to do to prevent it, I don't really have to explain why. It's going to be intuitive, because when you understand that biology, that base underpinning of what is the small hive beetle up to? What are these Varroa mites trying to do? And how can I fight them in that process? It's a heck of a lot easier if you know what the mite is doing. When I tell you, well, this one kills them in the brood and this one doesn't, you'll go, but there is no brood this time of year, but these are when the mites are producing the most, but this is when they're transmitting the viruses. So I don't have to explain that whole recipe to you. I can just give you a sketch and you can say, "Oh yeah, right," because I know how it works. And to carry that metaphor a little further, it's nice to be able to get a recipe for really good cookies and to bake those cookies. But if you go into the pantry one day and you say, "Well, geez, my recipe calls for baking powder, but all I have is baking soda." If you don't know what the baking powder was doing in the recipe, and if you don't know what baking soda is and whether it is it an alternative, well, it's not one to one, but how do I use it? If you don't have that deeper understanding, the recipe that served you well for the last few years is suddenly going to fail you. And we see that. We do our best to make sure that every miticide is in the warehouse, so when somebody wants to buy it, we can ship it to them. And we fail. And it's not us failing to order it. It's the manufacturers will go, "Oh, we forgot. Oh, the batch was bad, and we're all on vacation, but maybe next week we'll make another batch." Well, now suddenly
Yeah.
that miticide's not available for a few weeks. So if a beekeeper needs it and they can't have it, they better not have been depending exclusively on just that one thing. So I think that's, you can read a lot of recipes, but the way I cook is I read 3 or 4 recipes and then I kind of average them together because I understand what all those ingredients were doing to get to that big picture.
Yep.
I think the same is true of beekeeping. You've got it. What are you doing? What am I doing? What's my buddy doing? What's my buddy that succeeded doing? What's my buddy that failed doing? And then from there, you can figure out your own path pretty easily.
That's right. And David, I liken it to this, in my family, my dad was like a mechanical engineer, electrician, plumber, all that stuff. And the two of us, my brother and I, we both really kind of, I wouldn't say we got that genetic ability, but it came easy for us. It really did. And so I've found that with insects, there are some people that have this almost like an innate ability to understand insects, while there are others that have been in beekeeping for years and they just cannot grasp at all what this whole thing is about.
And it's about being open to, if your perspective is I want to make honey, or your perspective is I want to impress my friends by becoming a successful beekeeper, you can do those things. Those can be part of your goals. But if you say, I don't need to really learn about this biology, I don't need to learn cool facts about bees because that's not relevant to what I'm doing here, you're always going to be confused. You're always going to be in the dark because you just don't know what the bees are doing without you. I'm going to be the keynote speaker at the Honeybee Veterinary Consortium's upcoming meeting in North Carolina. And they have me giving a bunch of lectures. I'll be talking about Varroa and I'll be talking about other things. But the main sort of keynote lecture I'm giving is about nest site decision-making and collective intelligence, how bees allocate their workforce to make honey, and how those swarm scouts figure out how to find a new home. And that has nothing to do with veterinarians trying to advise beekeepers on how to keep their bees alive. But it's that step backwards into the biology. It's just letting the bees be cool because they're cool and learning about them because they're so fascinating. And then when you go into the beekeeping of it, it's no longer that mystery, because you can start to make those intuitive guesses about, well, I'm seeing this behavior, but I do know that they need, well, of course, they have to swarm to reproduce. So it's not that I've failed when they swarm. Swarming is actually that I've given the bees everything they needed to succeed. It's just their metric for success is making a swarm, and my metric for success is making honey and not swarming.
Right.
So that's where our goals are misaligned, and I've got to work with the bees. But people, people beat themselves up because they just don't ever take the bees' perspective. And so they're always confused about why the bees aren't following instructions.
Yep. I think that's a good point. And I think, getting each beekeeper to realize it's a joy in learning everything you can about bee biology, anatomy of the honeybee, anatomy of the colony. The more you learn about all these different things about the bees and how the hive functions and all, the more options you have, the more understanding you have to make better decisions. But if you just constantly rely on somebody else to give you the immediate answer to help you out of a pinch, and you never do follow up and say, how do I avoid getting in that scenario again? You're going to wind up in that scenario again and have to depend on somebody else again. And the bad thing about it is, David, a lot of times people will ask Bob, what do I do, Bob? And Bob will tell them. But if you ask Bob how he knows, Bob learned it from Dean, and Dean learned it from Tim. And if there's no science, it may be working, it may not be working, but we don't really have a full understanding. It's just being passed around is what I'm experiencing. And an example of that is the laying worker. It was taught forever that if you have laying workers, there's one of them in there. Right. And all you need to do is shake them out in the yard and it won't be able to fly back because, it's too big laying eggs and all. Right. It's not true at all. They're foragers and they're going to beat you back to the hive before you get And it's just like, that's a scenario that I see that but I think it's improving. I think it's getting better.
Yes, and part of it is high quality bee education, and it's sort of the structured formal education that you do or that I do through Better Bee, and it's also the informal. It's us having a YouTube channel and chatting with folks and going over these topics and answering questions. But I think that as you said, it was sort of the Wild West in the beekeeping YouTube world 10 years ago. There
Oh,
were a
yeah.
lot of goofballs who were just trying to get attention. And I
Oh,
think
yeah.
more and more we're able to steer people and say, look, like, listen to what Dave has to say on his channel, and then go to the Better Bee channel, and then go see what, Cayman Reynolds is talking about, and go see what, Fred Dunn is talking about. You can put together a pretty trustworthy list of folks, and I wouldn't take anything any of us says as gospel.
Yeah.
But
Right.
if three out of the 10 are agreeing on something, it's worth paying attention to. If 7 out of the 10 are saying it, it's probably, at least pretty close to true.
Yeah.
So I think that those are sort of the perspectives that more and more beekeepers are taking in these different channels, and we just have to make sure that we're finding ways to stamp out bad information or rumor or hearsay. And
Yeah.
if we don't know the answer, sit down and do the research. There are honeybee labs around the country, and there are students in those labs going, I wonder what questions the beekeepers would be interested in, but nobody tells them, so they don't know. They don't know what questions people are grappling with.
David, we're going to take some questions in just a minute, but I want to say one more thing about it. What I'm excited about beekeeping is there's a close relationship between observing honeybees, that's a superorganism, and then observing humanity and how we function with each other. And I'm really excited about that. I really believe, I can't really put it into words, but for years I've thought that there's a correlation between this, each honeybee, it's its own single like cell in a human body similarly. But if we could just find a way for this to carry over, if people could learn to coexist and to work together, work hard, work together as honeybees do. They bump into each other, they have whatever differences of jobs that they do, but they form one colony and they get it done. And that is really how I believe humanity is designed to exist. And I think we're missing that.
Yeah. And the key is in a honeybee colony, part of why that all works is that the reason the bees are working together is that they have aligned interests. They all want the queen and her offspring to succeed. They all want the colony to survive the winter. Whether I live or I die, it doesn't matter, because the colony as a whole will continue. My family will continue. And I think that perspective, it doesn't have to just be your human biological family. It's finding the ways that people are all interested in the same goals. And when we're all interested in those same goals, the teamwork comes naturally, because nobody's going to cheat. No one's going to, try to get one up on the other guy, because we're all working together for the same thing. And, we see in honeybees this beautiful example of cooperation and collaboration, but we also see violence and warfare. Because if I've got 2 colonies and one of them's stronger than the other, but the weak one has a whole bunch of honey and there's nothing available because all the flowers have died in the first frost, then I'm going to see robbing. And that robbing is basically honeybee warfare. So they have the capacity for violence and hostility, just like we obviously know that humans do. We know we can, we're pretty good at finding conflict. But if we put in a little bit of effort and find those places where we're aligned, I think you're exactly right. We're always more interesting and more successful and more productive when we're working together towards a goal. And it's just a matter of finding those common shared goals.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Absolutely. All right, Sherry, if you have any questions you want to throw at David, I'll be off the hook for answering questions. We'll let David tackle these tonight. Yeah. All right, David, what do you think about collecting drones and setting local thresholds instead of nurse bees? How accurate are Varroa mite counts in the first place? Bees in the wild survive without treatment.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start at the end and work backwards. So there are colonies of bees that survive in the wild without treatment. A lot of those bees show genetic markers. They have genetic traits that help to contribute to their survival, but that's not enough. So remember, I talked about catching those bees in the forest and bringing them into an apiary to study them. If I didn't treat those bees for mites, they would die from Varroa mites and the viruses they transmit. So part of it is living in the forest, swarming regularly, being in a small colony that gets honey-bound a few times a year during honey flows. All of that is contributing to it. So they're getting those brood breaks. They're isolated from one another. They also have these adaptive traits. So some bees, under some circumstances, can survive without treatment. Bees in a 10-frame Langstroth hive stacked up to the sky, are going to require some management, because we're putting them into a very productive, but maybe not very mite suppressive lifestyle.
Yeah.
The rest of this question, though, is about this idea that Zach Lamas's work on the idea that Varroa are spending time on drones for at least part of the year, and that if you sample your drones, you might find some of your Varroa mites there. There was some interesting work that was done catching drones at drone. I think it was out of Jamie Ellis's lab. I reviewed the paper, but I can't. Oh, that's supposed to be a secret. I was one of the reviewers on the paper, but they were talking about how they were identifying Varroa mites on drones at drone congregation sites, far away from the colonies themselves. So we've known for a long time that mites are on drones sometimes. The question is, how many? And at this point, my recommendation is you should still be using the scientifically validated sample of measuring the mite population on your nurse bees, because we know how that changes over the course of a season. If you go out and you start taking, fistfuls of drones and throwing them into your alcohol wash cup, you can figure out how many mites are on the drones, but you have no idea what that means. And the season of the year and the state of the colony, bees that are queenless or thinking about superseding don't evict their drones in the fall when all of the other bees do. So the colony status can affect sort of where those drones are in their own lives too. So I think that there's some excitement here that there may be some interesting potential to learn more. But remember, when we sample all of the drones to find out their mite levels, or all of the nurses to find out their mite levels, we're still not looking inside the brood. So we still aren't looking at all the mites. We're only sampling the mites from the sample that we know we're looking at. And we have the most data on those nurse samples. So that's the best option that you've got, even though, sure, there might be other interesting data if we were sampling different things as well.
Yeah. All right. Good question, James. Let's have another question. Okay. Is all acetic acid wood bleach the same? I know only one has the thumbs up, but older beekeepers will tell you it doesn't matter. Wow.
Older beekeepers will tell you it doesn't matter is sort of a summary of getting advice from older beekeepers. They'll tell you nothing matters except the things they think matter.
Yeah.
So the only legal oxalic acid for mite control in the United States is apibioxol, and that is a miticide that has an EPA label. It's approved by the EPA. Every single batch of that oxalic acid gets tested. They're testing for heavy metal residues. They're testing for, contaminants that might be toxic to honeybees. All of these known compounds that could get into it, they're testing for. And then there's a batch report that goes along with every one, and it gives you dosage instructions. The purity is guaranteed to be exactly the same. It's not going to be slightly stronger or slightly weaker. It's exactly what it is. So for all of those reasons, it definitely has advantages. It also is the cheapest miticide per hive compared to any other treatment, even buying the illegal stuff that's expensive. I will say up front, and I do want to be upfront about this, Better Bee is the U.S. distributor for apibioxol, and they chose us because I was giving lectures on oxalic acid law and explaining to people sort of what we know about this stuff and why it makes sense to use the labeled products beforehand. And so they heard about that lecture and they said, well, you seem like the right company to distribute this stuff. So, if I encourage you to use it, yeah, sure, technically at some point Better Bee's making a couple of cents off of it, but I don't get a sales commission. So that's not my motivation here. Wood bleach is typically going to be roughly the same purity as the oxalic acid in that package. And wood bleach is also probably not going to have heavy metal contamination or some other weird thing in it. However, if you use wood bleach to treat your bees and then somebody eats your honey and they claim that they've gotten sick, and the bee inspector or the police or whoever come and they investigate your colonies and they find out that instead of using the EPA-approved miticide, you're using something you bought at the hardware store, that's an illegal application of a potentially toxic compound. And so even if the wood bleach isn't what got somebody sick, you could be, criminally liable or you could get in big trouble for it. So the balancing act here is not, can I save $5 by buying the cheaper wood bleach at the store and just hope that nobody ever, catches me doing it. I think the balance here should be, when I buy that oxalic acid, I know that the label tells me to use this dosage of it, but research is telling me that higher dosages have some, potentially better miticidal effects. So that I think is a conversation for beekeepers to have, and I in my position at Better Bee are working with the manufacturers to actually increase the oxalic acid dosage. And that's going to make the legal dosage, the dosage that every university professor or extension person or whoever can legally tell you to use, at the same level that the science is telling us is most effective. And there's only a budget to do that, to pay all of those EPA fees, if people are buying the legal stuff. So the whole beekeeping industry gets held back if we're buying the wood bleach and not paying the extra couple of cents that, you've had plenty of folks who are donating money. I see it pop up during this chat to support what we're doing here. And I'd say in the same way, those folks should be buying the legal products because it puts money into the pipeline. It makes it worth the while of these manufacturing companies to go to the EPA and say, hey, we know that this beekeepers will benefit and their bees will benefit if we bump up that legal dose. So we're going to pay the fee and file the paperwork and do the studies and all of that in order to make the legal dose match the science.
Yeah, good answer. Yeah, all right, I like that. Let's see if we can get another few questions in. Hi, Daves. What are the differences between Apivar and Apialife Var?
I often say, if I was the king of bees, and I'm getting there, so maybe someday, if I was the king of bees, the very first thing that I would do is I would go and rename every single miticide because it drives me crazy. Apigard and Apialife Var and Apivar, and it's horrible. And somebody told me that Apialife Var is actually older than Apivar, so they feel like they ripped it off. But the point of it is, api is just apis, bee in Latin. Var is just Varroa in Latin. Life is just because it feels fun to put the word life in your product. So it's all marketing nonsense. Apivar is a synthetic miticide. It's a synthetic miticide strip. The miticide is called Amitraz. It's the same stuff that some ne'er-do-well commercial beekeepers will buy illegally and put into their hives. The legal way to do that is to buy these plastic strips impregnated with the synthetic miticide. It is not safe to use with honey supers on because it is a synthetic chemical and it could potentially be harmful to people who eat that honey. And so you use it when your supers are off, and it kills mites as long as the mites haven't evolved resistance to Amitraz. And we know that some mites have, but we also know that it doesn't seem to persist all that long if people are rotating between different miticides. So it's a useful tool in the toolkit in fighting Varroa. Apialife Var, despite the similar name, is completely different. It is a thymol-based miticide, but it is thymol, menthol, eucalyptol, I think camphor. There might be some other thing, but basically it's a thymol product. It's a little briquette, a little wafer that is soaked with this thymol, and you break it into quarters and you put it on top of your hive, and then it's going to create this thymol fume that's going to kill the mites. And you reapply that 3 times, and so it's going to kill all of the mites that sort of were in the brood during the first application. They're out and about on the second one. You also can't use that with your supers on. Technically the EPA doesn't make distinctions about this, but the reason you don't want a synthetic chemical getting into your honey is that it's a synthetic chemical and that can be really harmful. The reason that you don't want thymol getting into your honey is that it just makes your honey taste bad. So, you can't use it with supers on, but it's more of a honey contamination problem than a major health and safety issue. But even so, you don't want to have your supers on when you're using it, but as long as those supers are off, it does a good job of killing mites. So 2 different products, 2 very similar names. Both of them kill Varroa mites, but they do it in different ways, and they're the right product for the right beekeeper at the right time. And whether you are the beekeeper for product A or product B is a matter of your circumstances.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Sherry. Now, David, you're going to have some rapid fire answers. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes. So
okay,
see if you can rapid fire these answers. We use Amitraz and VetMed for managing dogs. Is it safe in the summer for bees?
The only Amitraz that you should be legally putting into your hives is going to be Apivar strips. They have the risk of potentially contaminating honey. So if you have no supers on, using Apivar strips is perfectly safe to use inside a colony according to the label instructions. So yes, it's fine to use in summer as long as you're not trying to make saleable human harvestable honey at that time.
But the Amitraz has to say it's for bees.
Correct. It needs to be Apivar strips or Amaflex, which is a new product they're bringing out, but both made by Vito Pharma. Yes. Did a quick inspection, pulled off Formic Pro. 1 hive had 2 capped and 1 recently opened queen cells. That's always exciting. What are chances of queen being successful? Okay. So, Northern Idaho, that is a wide temperature range. So It is not uncommon for a colony to build queen cells during a formic acid treatment. It does not necessarily mean that the queen is dead or gone. It sometimes means that they got nervous and they started the supersedure process, but then the old queen is there. And I've often seen colonies rip down those queen cells afterwards.
Yep.
However, if you say 2 capped and 1 recently open, and I assume that means 1 recently emerged queen, that means that your queen grew up potentially during that formic acid treatment period. Formic acid products have a, typically, maybe a 2-week treatment window. Read whatever the package says for the particular product. But the vast majority of the formic acid comes out in the first 48 hours. So most of that formic would have been long gone by the time those queens did most of their development. But that early stage when they were getting selected and they were getting turned into new queen cells, well, those still could have been exposed to a high dose of formic acid. So I would be certainly skeptical of those queens, and I would look very, very closely at them after she comes back, after she's mated, once she starts laying. If you have easy access to other queens, those would be the first queens for me to sacrifice because I just wouldn't trust them. But I can't say for sure that they're definitely going to have major health problems, or will at least be able to get you through to the spring, but maybe those are the queens you replace that upcoming spring.
Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
What point do you remove an oxalic acid towel? Okay, so great. So the oxalic acid shop towel method is something Randy Oliver has been publishing about because he has an experimental use permit for a very long time. And for a period of time last year, they were legal in Vermont, New York, and Delaware until the EPA said to each of those states, we don't think those should be legal. And the states said, we agree with you, EPA, they aren't legal anymore. And then they weren't legal anywhere. So legally, you should not be using oxalic acid shop towels in your hive unless you have an experimental use permit. Now, let's assume that you do have an experimental use permit. In that circumstance, your permit would tell you what you can do, but folks who have those permits and who have tested this have found that essentially you can leave those shop towels in for 1 month or 2 months, and that essentially the oxalic acid just slowly degrades over time. If it's mixed with glycerin, that glycerin is also degrading over time. So it's essentially just becoming more and more inert as time goes by. So the removal is not baked into any of those protocols because there is no EPA labeled product that allows you to do this. But the protocols that were legalized in Vermont, New York, and Delaware, I think all recommended a 2-month application period.
Yeah.
It might have been 1.5 months to 2 months, but it's not legal. We're working on changing those laws, but we haven't done it yet.
Yeah, good point. Yep. Another question. If you have to take off supers before you treat for mites, what do you do with the supers in the treatment time?
You've got 2 options. Option number 1 is that you take the supers off and then you extract the honey from them. And because the whole point of having them put the honey in the supers and not in the brood nest was that eventually you were planning to take that honey. So if it's all capped and ready to go, maybe you just harvested your honey. If you want to have them keep working those supers, if the honey in those supers is not, capped and ready to go, you've got sort of 2 options. Number 1, don't choose a miticide that you can't use with supers on. Use one of the miticides that you can use with supers on. If you need to treat and you have supers, then just don't choose something that's incompatible. I have met beekeepers who have knocked all the bees out or used a fume board to get all the bees out of their supers, and then they take those supers and they stack them all on the one colony in the apiary that has the lowest mite counts. And those bees are basically the custodians of the honey in those supers for a while. You've got to have real firm ground and a very, very level colony, because the taller that stack gets, the riskier it is that it might tip over.
Yeah.
But I have met folks who maybe for an apiary of 20 colonies will take all of the supers and put them on 2 or 3 colonies, do a miticide application. When they can move the supers back, then they treat those 2 or 3 that were holding them. So there's a game you can play that way, but typically I'd say just don't use a miticide that's super incompatible until you're ready to take those supers off.
Yeah, and so now I think now Formic Pro or oxalic acid you can use now with.
Yep, correct. Apibioxyl, oxalic acid, Formic Pro, HopGuard are all legal for you to use with your supers on.
Yep. Last question.
Oh, so often I have an observation hive right here, and they forage and come and go through my office window. But I only set that up in the fall and then take it down in the spring because I've got a lot of stuff to do, and I don't want to be dealing with a 2-frame observation hive all summer. So generally it's a colony that I say to the bee team. We've got our head beekeeper, Ann Fry, who's also an EAS master beekeeper. I say, Anne, any colony that you're thinking about culling or combining with another one, if you've got just a real weak queen, but you don't quite have the heart to kill her, give her to me. She'll live in the observation hive, and they'll just sort of putter along for a little bit.
Yeah.
But even those weak queens, once I get them through, when spring starts showing up, there's always a risk that they're going to swarm on me before I get them cleared out.
Yeah.
But they'll be back there within a month or two.
Oh, yeah. Well, David, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for dropping in tonight.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Thank you for having me. It's been a thrill. Yeah. And if you ever want to have me back, if you ever want to talk about mites or bees or anything else, I'm always happy to.
Oh, yeah. We're going to have you back. Everybody loves you tonight. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Great. I want to tell you guys about what's coming up next week on Thursday night. We're having Bee Informed Partnership. We have Eric coming on with us along with Mary Ann. And do you know them, Dave?
Yeah, I don't know that I've met Eric, but you know, I love Bee Informed Partnership and everything they do. They're a real great organization.
Great. So next week we're going to be taking donations on our live stream, and we're going to be matching those to give to them. They have quite a big impact on beekeepers. They're doing a lot of data collection, some surveys, that the information that they have available is really contributing to help beekeepers and beehives. So it is something that Sherry and I look forward to having them on and supporting, and it's going to benefit all of us. So we want you all to be here next Thursday night to talk to them and see what's going on there. And want to thank all of you for being a part of the live stream tonight. And it's been really fun having Dr. David Peck on. And if you ever get a chance to see David speak somewhere, you gotta be sure and drop in, say hello to him. And so I want to thank all of you for being a part of my YouTube channel as well. Been making a lot of beekeeping channels this week about how to prepare for winter, what you can do in the fall, and how difficult it can be to inspect those hives in the fall when they're all cram-packed with bees and everybody wants to rob and nobody's foraging because there's a dearth. I made some videos to help you guys out, so be sure and check that out as well. And we want to thank Jessica for working as our hostess today in the comment section. And thank you, Sherry, for working everything behind the scenes for us all. And David, we hope to get you online with us again soon. And we're going to say good night to everybody. Thanks for being here. See you, David.
Everybody.
Yep. Good night.